This last week, Netflix released part 2 of the Zack Snyder space opera Rebel Moon, and it's not really going too well for him. And for lack of a better term, he's kind of freaking out a little bit and has some preposterous things to say about people who don't actually like his movies. But I'll get more on that in a little bit. First, let's look at this article from Comic Book Resources. It's kind of talking about what's going wrong with this movie. So here it says, after the first Rebel Moon movie struggled to garner favor, Zack Snyder and Netflix hope Part 2, The Scargiver, can restore good faith in the space opera film franchise. Unfortunately, The Scargiver is off to a bad start and has already secured an unfortunate record for Snyder. The Scargiver, released via Netflix on April 19th, has a 14% critical rating on Rotten Tomatoes, comfortably the lowest rated movie ever by Snyder. And if you go over to Rotten Tomatoes right now, you can see the score is a little bit better than when that article was written. It says 18%, so slightly improvement, but still nothing good by any stretch of the imagination. But more importantly, I think the audience score is something to take into consideration, because 45%, slightly above what critics think, but still it's a pretty terrible score. And when you compare it to Rebel Moon Part 1, it's even worse in both categories. And this was a movie I did review for my channel. You can check out that if you want to hear more of my thoughts. But just to kind of sum it up, I thought it was just an all style over substance sort of thing. And from what I've heard about the second part, I haven't watched it yet, but a lot of people I have read about said that it's more or less the same thing. Going back to the article, several notable outlets have been unimpressed by what they've seen from The Scargiver. The Hollywood Reporter slammed one sequence in the sequel where the characters harvest wheat for what seems longer than a Swedish art film. Okay. Meanwhile, Total Films Review said Snyder's sci-fi epic stumbled towards the finish line with an underwhelming Part 2 that feels more like a Part 1.5. And that was kind of the criticisms I had for the first Rebel Moon movie, because it really did feel like an incomplete movie, almost like the first act of a movie. And I understand it's supposed to be a Part 1 and there's supposed to be more that follows after it, but you got to think something like, let's say, The Fellowship of the Ring, even though that was the first part in a trilogy, the first movie still very much acted as a movie should act. It had a 3-act structure to it, and it had a beginning, middle, and an end. The first Rebel Moon movie just seemed like it was just getting off the ground, and then the movie just kind of ended in a very underwhelming kind of manner. And it seems like Rebel Moon Part 2 is more or less the same thing, because Zack Snyder said that he envisioned it to have like an expanding lore, and he wants to be able to do 6 movies of this sort of thing. So I think in his mind, because even though I will give him credit that he is talented as a visual director to a point, as a writer, he's very lacking in that. He has decent ideas as far as like what stories can do, like with Rebel Moon, for instance, saying you wanted to do like a 7 Samurai movie but in space. I think that's kind of a cool idea. I mean, we've seen reimaginings of 7 Samurai, like with The Magnificent Seven, to say like, hey, instead of a samurai movie, make it a Western with cowboys. All right, cool idea. If you wanted to say instead of samurais, we make it in space or something like that, a sci-fi version of that, I think that's a decent idea. And there's sequences in Rebel Moon Part 1, or even in a lot of Zack Snyder movies, that might look good, but this movie just seems to be Zack Snyder completely unchained, where he's just free to do whatever he wants. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but this is something that he's complaining about in a recent interview talking about this movie. And I got this clip pulled up of him during this interview, and just take a look at what he has to say about Rebel Moon and what he thinks about people who kind of criticized his work.
Just focus group them. Why don't we do
AI
that?
in
yeah,
there.
Let the AI decide. Yeah, exactly. Because by the way, that's where we are in some ways. I always go like, look, you may love or hate my movies, and
But they're
I'm
yours.
100%.
They are 100%
I'm
Zack's
100%
movies.
fine with that. But a vote against me is a vote for the focus group version.
Right.
Just know that.
Yeah.
Know that by saying, Snyder sucks.
Yeah.
You're also saying, you know what? Give me some more focus groups.
Give me the down the middle, vanilla.
Give me some more. I want Happy Meals. I don't want, that's all I'm saying. It's fine.
This is kind of a dumb statement on Zack Snyder's part, because it's not a matter of you let the director have all the control or you let the studio have all the control, because in reality, the best is probably a combination of the two. And I like to use Star Wars as an example, because we got 3 trilogies to pull from where we can see each one of these play out. You get the original trilogy where George Lucas was the creative force behind it, but you still have other writers and directors giving their input. And as a result, the original trilogy is the most universally loved. Then you can move on to the prequel trilogy where George Lucas was pretty much the sole creative force behind it. And even though I personally like the prequel trilogy fine because I kind of grew up with it, there's a lot of other people who don't like it, and I understand the criticism for it. And a lot of the criticism is that George Lucas had too much creative control. Then you can look at the Disney sequel trilogy, where it was basically the studio dictating what goes on, and that's the one that's most universally hated. So we got 3 examples to work from here. So it's not just you have to have one or the other. Like I was saying, I think a combination of the two is probably what works best. And I reject the idea that focus groups are inherently bad, because I know we hear about stories like this all the time where the ending of a movie was terrible. And then you hear like, oh yeah, it was originally going to be like this, but focus groups and test audiences didn't like that. So they changed it to like this. And that's why it's so bad. But you have to understand, studios have an incentive to try to take as much credit as possible and pass off as much blame as possible. So when a test audiences ask them to make a change to the ending and they do, and it's not really good, the studio wants to say, yeah, this is what we were going to do, but those test audiences screwed it up. But if the test audiences actually ask them to make changes and it turns out it's good, the studio is not going to want to report that that's what happened. They're going to take as much credit as possible. You hear stories like that every now and then about how test audiences actually got it right, but those are few and far between. And that's because, like I said, studios just want to make sure that they get all the credit when things work out. Now, I don't think Zack Snyder is a bad director. Like I said, I think he is decent visually, but he does need to have other people rein him in a little bit, because when you look at early on in his career with movies like Dawn of the Dead or 300 or Watchmen, those are some of his better movies, and that's because there was a story laid out in front of him with a certain visual scheme to it that he can add his own flair to, versus some of his later movies when he had more creative control by himself, such as like Sucker Punch, Army of the Dead, or the Rebel Moon movies. In those situations, like I was saying, I don't think he knows how to tie these certain sequences and shots that he has in mind together in a satisfying manner. And that's why they seem like they're just strung together on shoestring plots with lack of character development and other things like that. He argues if it's not the director having the creative say, then it's just watered down with focus group to death, the studio having 100% of the control. And like I was saying, that's not necessarily the case. You can have a combination of the two in a manner that works. Now, some directors, I think they are better suited having more studio interference in their projects. Other directors, I think they're better just being left to their own devices. And it really is just a matter of the individual director and the individual project that they're working on. He was saying when it's too much studio interference, then everything is basically just like a Happy Meal. And while that might not be satisfying if you're comparing that to fine dining, it would be more satisfying if the chef is only capable of just heating up ramen, and that's essentially it. So that's why I think Zack Snyder, he should be taking advice from people who are more critical of his work and saying like, well, maybe I should be open to more input when it comes to future movies. If he's not willing to do that, then I think we're going to see more of this in the future, and it's going to be a matter of time before he's not even able to get any work, because nothing he does is successful. But let me know what you think about all this in the comment section below. Do you think Zack Snyder's right where you need to leave the directors alone, or do you think that they should have a little bit more input from outside sources? And if you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button if you want to stay up to date with the latest entertainment news. And don't forget to like and share the video, because it really helps out with the channel. Thank you.